oil prices increased strongly.
It's affecting us very bad. As a e-hailing services rely on the petrol, so it's bad for us.
It affects the cost of my nanny who comes into work. It affects everything, and I'm trying to make sure that the impact on her is actually less than it is on me.
Sort of 5 days in order to spend 80% of their salaries, which actually only leaves them, sort of 20% for the rest of the month.
We're obviously influenced a lot more by the higher rates of food inflation that we're seeing, whereas the more wealthy are influenced by higher levels of, for example, electricity or fuel inflation.
In the short term will lead to less disposable income for many households.
Spiraling cost of living raising eyebrows as most families begin to buckle under the pressure of high electricity, food and fuel prices. A recent index that compares prices of similar goods in different countries found that South African consumers were paying considerably more for basic goods and services. The index compared with major African economies such as Nigeria and Egypt. Not only does this reduce the buying power of South Africans, but it severely impacts the quality of life. Joining us now for their take on the matter on the rising cost of living is Isobel Frye, a director at Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute and a program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, Mervyn. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight on In Focus. Isobel, let's start with you. Are we staring down a barrel of a rising cost of living crisis?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to share some of our analysis this evening. I think that it's clear that we are, indeed, Tabo, and I think that the point is that many of us on previous shows of yours have warned of this coming forward, and the fact that it has been arising. And the question is why policymakers have not listened, and whether it is now the time for people to start taking the data seriously, and to start looking at the kinds of interventions that we require in order to stave off massive widespread starvation among South Africans, an upper middle income country, in coming months.
Is this something that we can do something about, Isobel, in terms of fiscal policy? The President, I tell you, writing today, I'm sure you've seen already, saying that, well, much of the rise in prices that we are seeing is as a result, for example, of the factors that are outside of government's control. Russia-Ukraine war, things that have got to do with fuel prices, which is not controlled in the country. Is that necessarily true that government can't do anything to cushion off, especially the poorest?
It's a really complex question, and so an easy answer doesn't sort of come to hand. On the one hand, you have concerns that the state has about what is affordable going forward, about making promises that can't be kept if they start overreaching in terms of the kinds of spending commitments. And you can understand that in terms of sort of ledger books and balances. But we also have the real situation that people are desperate, people are starving, and we do have vast resources which can be tapped. So, I mean, one of the things that we've been calling for is the fact that this needs to be called a humanitarian crisis, and that's what it is. We need to be looking at the kinds of extraordinary measures that a state would take. I mean, if you look at the impact that we have on our population, it cannot go on being told that this is something which is beyond our control. I mean, one of the things that is within our control, for instance, is the payment of social grants. And yet for the last 2 months, no social relief of distress 350 grant has been paid out. I mean, that's a shocking statement. It's a statement that says that the interests of the beneficiaries, of the between 10 and 11 million beneficiaries who are looking to the state just for 350 rand, are being completely ignored. Now, why is it that we're not using all of our political will as a country to get that done? So there are definite ways in which we can not just signal, but actually make sure that the needs of the poorest are addressed at basic. and then start looking at ways in which we can strengthen that safety net by unlocking wealth that is currently set aside, for instance, in the PIC and other government funds, areas in which money is locked up, which it doesn't have to be. So, yes, there are definite ways that we can be doing something, and certainly to say that wars outside of our borders are outside of our control doesn't take the burden of responsibility off the shoulders of government.
Yeah. Mervyn Abrams, you will be able to answer this because you have, of course, in previous times spoken to us about the extent to which food was rising compared to, I suppose, what's happening around the continent in particular. What has been the experience of South Africans now when it comes to buying the most essential, and what are they having to choose between? I mean, in other parts of the world, they're having, for example, having to choose between buying food and buying heating, energy, because they rely on gas quite a lot. What is the experience of South Africans?
So good evening and thank you, Thabo. So the information that we are gaining from people that we work with in low-income communities are that, for instance, they are cutting back on the amount of food that they consume. They are looking for the cheapest food possible. They have cut back on all forms of nutrition and are only buying staples, whether it's maize meal or rice or bread. And so what we are seeing is an increased situation of hunger, a deepening situation of malnutrition. And in a sense, the country, we are going to have to pay for this trouble. It is in everyone's interest that food is accessible to every South African, because food is at the basis of human development, but it's also at the basis of economic productivity. It is also at the basis of innovation and creativity, and so about economic growth in the future. So it is of critical importance for all of us. And then I would like to say, in the question that you had mentioned or asked Isobel about what President Ramaphosa had said, that the factors are totally outside of our control. Yes, that might be the case. But South Africa do have, and the government does have, an obligation to plan to stop our exposure to risks. South African economy is extremely exposed to global supply lines. We have to start thinking about building our own resilience locally, particularly around things like agricultural inputs, fertilizers, etc., so that when we do have risks such as this, the war in Ukraine, then the country is to some extent protected. But currently we are absolutely not protected.
Is it something that we can do in the next 12 months? The president is saying, well, we are working on building the resilience of the agricultural sector in South Africa against the influences of what happens internationally. Is that something that can happen in the next 12 months?
Well, it will be extremely difficult to do in the next 12 months, but we have to start, and we have to start somewhere, and we have to start someday. So if the government is intent and the political will is there, and the private sector is prepared to enter into that debate, then that will be a good thing, because we have to start building, we have to increase our local reserves, for instance. So wheat reserves, maize reserves, so that when there are global crises such as this, and price volatility comes onto the market, then government can release some of those reserves onto the market and thereby force down the price of some of our staple foods.
Yeah. Isobel, government to tell us that 350 social relief of distress grant amounts to billions in terms of what they are putting as relief for people who are under pressure. The question, is this enough? But not only that, are we correctly, I'm looking for a word, are we correctly spreading the support to where it is needed the most?
I think your question as to where support is needed most is a critical question. I think if you look at a country where 56% of people live below the upper bound poverty line, and where 1 in 4 people is actually starving, the question is to where we spread it. is a tricky one. And if you look at the means testing that is going on with the current social relief of distress, the 350 grant, that really has brought the challenge of who is poor into stark relief. So what the National Treasury has done in order to reduce the number of people who are eligible for the 350 Rand grant is to raise the means test, reduce the means test, and therefore reduce the number of people eligible. So previously you were able to have up to 600 Rand of income that you generate from other sources. Right now that's really been reduced to almost absolutely nothing. So what we're saying is that we're reducing people's incentive to try and provide for themselves for fear that that's going to knock them off the 350. I think, Thabo, we've had discussions before about why we say from our research that a universal basic income grant is the way to go, because there are so many people who are invisible to the system but who live in poverty, and in fact their poverty makes them invisible to the bureaucracy, that we have what social policy makers call areas of exclusion. And to us, both for economic reasons as well as for human rights reasons, it's much better to include people than it is to exclude and to penalize. In fact, what we're doing by having a means test is we're trying to say to people, we will criminalize you for claiming 350 Rand. And I think if you look at the steps and procedures that it takes to claim the 350 Rand, for anyone to go through those hoops, it means that they need the money. And in a sense, the actual application form is important. And so what Mervyn was saying is something I'd like to pick up on, is that our economy, we're at risk of stagflation because we're actually not growing. We have higher inflation, but because we are not circulating the money through monetary policy, because we're not enabling everybody to be an active economic citizen, what we're doing is our economy is grinding to a halt. If we instead take the bold move and say we're going to distribute income so that everybody has the ability not only to meet their needs, but also to become a consumer and a producer, it means that we start dismantling those brakes that are on our economy, because otherwise the situation that we're in is not going to improve. And in fact, every quarter when we look at the unemployment figures, it's going to get worse. Every time we look at the food poverty line, which is due to come out again in July, we're going to have more and more people falling below that. And the problem is, it's not just today's problem. Today's problem becomes tomorrow's legacy. As Mervyn was saying, that malnutrition levels with children, once experienced, is never something you can catch up. So the cognitive ability, the ability of children to become productive adults, to be able to make rational decisions, is completely impaired if they lack that nutrition in their early childhood. And those are the kinds of costs that we need to be looking at.
So the debate then becomes whether we spend less, as in government, or we spend more. And if we are spending more, then, Isobel, are we likely facing more taxes?
I think that we do need to look at where the financing comes from. My research institute has released a number of really good papers that show that the financing doesn't have to only come through taxation, that there are a number of sources that we can tap into in order to reduce that fiscal spend. I think there would be some consideration of, for instance, things such as the transactions tax, the kinds of taxes that are spread so widely that they're not felt by those who are most vulnerable. We certainly could look at corporations tax. I mean, companies tax in 1993 was about just over 50%, and that's dropped down to 24%. So companies, which are meant to be the ones that drive the kind of growth and accumulation, have been arguing successfully to have their taxes cut in order to promote greater employment. But we've seen neither the spin-off on employment nor the generation of greater profits. So there are areas in which taxation could happen. At the same time, we really are aware of the fact that the middle class is incredibly heavily taxed. People who are able to reserve enough through income earning are not saving because of the way that money is being paid out. But we have to look and see where the burden of poverty should be lying and how we could be sharing that. So I think ultimately there are ways in which perhaps the kind of national expenditure can be made more efficient, and we don't need to look directly for the full burden of this to fall on people's taxes. But because this is a crisis, we need to look at immediate ways of getting in income. And then understanding that, for instance, if we had a universal basic income grant, within 3 years we could be looking at GDP growth of 4.7%. We could be looking at 3.7 million jobs that have been created. So the multiplier on state spend is the kind of thing that would shock our economy into becoming more sustainable. Right now, what we're seeing is that everybody sees the expenditure on grants as being a loss. It actually should be seen as a multiplier investment. And that's the one way that we could see growth happening in what is a very dismal economic situation.
Mervyn, Isobel, speaking of the burden of poverty and where it should be lying, right now the question being asked by many poor people is the privilege of making wealth. Where is that lying? Who are we working for? Who is making money out of this? Energy companies? Maybe? Producers of food? Who's making money out of this?
Well, so of course a lot of money is made in times of crisis. I mean, we saw during the COVID period, for instance, that the retail sector did extremely well. Their profits were well above other years. And so the oil companies and some of the logistics companies are really making big profits at this time. Thabo, I'm of the opinion, and I might be very simplistic, but if companies can afford to pay their CEO millions in bonuses, then surely they have massive profits. I mean, we should presume that. And so we should begin to call that out. And we should be asking on companies, particularly in the retail sector, to act as corporate citizens and to carry some of the burden of this increased prices, particularly around food at this particular stage of our history. Precisely because during the COVID period, they had made quite big profits.
Did we see any relief in terms of the cost of living with the reprieve given on the fuel, at least for the past 2 months?
So it's not. I mean, I think we could probably presume that if that a relief was not granted, that logistics costs would have increased and potentially food prices could have gone even higher. So the fact that, because there is a direct correlation between the cost of fuel and prices of food in the retail sector. So the fact that it hasn't, the government has kept the levy out, has, in a sense, will help, particularly when we begin to see the food price statistics at the end of this coming month.
Appreciate you both for coming on. Thank you very much, Isobel Frye, as well as Mervyn Abrams there in that conversation with us tonight. When we